Hey everyone, welcome back. Good to see you. Here we are again, another episode of revisiting the Road to Serfdom. Right, Kevin of Engineering Politics, myself are going through this book chapter by chapter, trying to help people understand the importance and the significance and the relevance, increasing relevance of Hayek's seminal work that was written mostly as a warning against socialism. I would say is one of the best ways to sum it up. But last time we went over chapters 1 and 2. Kevin, you want to walk people through kind of what those chapters were about and what they missed, and we'll put links to all this stuff for you guys. But just to recap for the folks at home.
Yeah, sure. So right now we're going to be on chapter 3. So chapter 1 covered the introduction material. Chapter 2, or not chapter 2, episode 1 covered the introduction material. Episode 2 covered chapter 1 and 2. And so just to do a quick summary of chapter 1, chapter 1 was titled The Abandoned Road, and it was mainly about abandoning the road to liberalism, which was the road that was creating progress and prosperity. And it was kind of this, road developed over time that we're able to kind of learn from and see what created the best prosperous country or created the most individual freedom. This concept of individual freedom and individual liberty was relatively new. I mean, considering human history, it's extremely new, right? But we found that we're able to progress as a whole, as a collective, as acting as a part of a more liberal society. And now this is a part where I want to make sure that we get our definitions correct, because I know a lot of conservative people out there, a lot of people who are like, oh, those darn liberals. We are talking about the definition of liberalism in the 19th European sense. That is individual freedom. Yeah, 19th century sense, which is individual freedom from government coercion. So that is the actual definition of liberalism. And when we talk about liberalism in this context, the Hayekian context, that is what we're going to be talking about. It is not the American sense, which, Hayek calls out in the introduction saying, why are you liberals allowing these other people to hijack this word? But in the American sense, it is the exact opposite. It is government intervention into everything, or the advocation for that. So that is not what we're talking about when we talk about liberalism. We're talking about it in the European sense. And then we went on to chapter 2, which is titled The Great Utopia, which is the adoption of socialism and collectivism. So once we veered off that road, we now veered on a different path, that instead of the road to liberalism, we're going on the road to servitude. And then that is where he gets into words like planning, which I know you can explain.
Yeah. So just to piggyback on what you just said briefly, what I said in the first one and say it every single time is that whenever you hear liberal, when you hear Hayek say liberal, think of probably our modern context, just think conservative, libertarian type thing, honestly. That's going to give you the best understanding of what he's talking about. But planning, so planning is this word that was thrown around, which really just means a top-down direction of the first off resources, and then those resources being put towards like various ends and stuff. So the opposite of planning would be, or at least planning in this sense, and Hayek does a good job of saying, like, look, there's two different kinds of planning here. Every single person who wants to solve common problems is a planner. And so he says, but whenever we're talking about planning, we're talking about planning that is doesn't use competition, that doesn't use the free market. This is, you have someone at the top, or a group of, benevolent philosopher kings at the top who are making decisions of, this is what prices should be. This is where these resources should go. This is where these resources should go. And planning just everything about society, everything about economic transactions, everything about like how should our collective labor be allocated, and how should resources be allocated. So planning is in a sense, if you think about like a wartime economy, when there's rationing, when you think about like, no, this factory is going to make this, you're not going to make refrigerators anymore. You're going to make tanks because we need tanks and we said so. Now in a wartime context, sure, that makes sense. But this is like a peacetime context of basically the government's going to decide where resources go, who gets what, and what things cost. And it's not left up to the market. It's not left up to like the price mechanism and individual like transactions and mutually beneficial transactions. It's up to, people at the top to decide that.
Yeah, absolutely. So planning is not really a term that's thrown around as much now. So, and even Hayek has said this in one of his later introductions, that it's not a word you see often, but socialism is now a word that's becoming more and more popular. And that was a word that he said, and after World War II, that was a word that was completely off limits. We don't talk about that. That's just a naughty word. But he said it will be rebranded and reinstituted in some way in the future. And he could not have been more right there. With open socialists in the American government and open socialists in just about every Western government right now. So, this came true. And this is the reason why this book is so important now, is to say, hey, this is the road that we saw Germany go down. This is the road we saw Italy go down. And he wasn't even able to expand into Russia yet because he wrote it in 1944. But he inspired people like George Orwell to talk about things that kind of went along the road of capitalism or communism. So, we see what happens when you move that far down. So I don't know if we want to dive into it right now. Chapter 3.
Yeah. One of the things I would just add, and then, is he does say, you're talking about how we don't use planning and stuff anymore, but one of the things that does get used, and I think he mentions this in maybe one of the 76 or something, is that it's words like social justice or, bureaucracies and these kinds of things that are being used, or like new liberties, new freedoms. And so it's the same idea as just being rebranded. But yeah, so chapter 3 is called Individualism and Collectivism. And one of the things that, it's been funny, at least the last couple of times that Kevin and I have went through this, that we'll have the exact same quotes and the exact same things in mind that we think are important and want to go over. And one of the things we did last time was there was a huge section in the middle of one of those chapters, I think it was chapter 1 actually, that was like, this is worth unpacking, this is worth diving into. In the beginning of chapter 3, Individualism and Collectivism, again, there's a link to a PDF that at least goes through chapter 3. You guys can follow along if you want. But we're going to unpack this thing, because I would say, and Kevin, you can tell me if you agree or disagree, but I feel like this is probably one of the most prescient things, at least so far, that we've covered. And we're going to get into this time and time again, where you read this and you're like, okay, this could have been written in 1944, or it could have been written 2 weeks ago. And so this to me seems like one of those sections that it is incredibly relevant for mapping onto our current context and worth kind of dissecting, as such. I don't know if you would agree with that statement.
This is
I don't know if I'm overstating it.
No, this is the trade-off that you get when you read very profound people. Is they're great, but every page you have to stop and think for like a half an hour and be like, wow. Mm-hmm. Like, what did I just read? How is this applicable to now? And this is what happened here. I mean, I think I copied the first 3 paragraphs verbatim because of how great he dove into the subject matter and how relevant it is today. So he does this time and time again. And I know we'll probably say this during every single episode, be like, all right, we had to quote this big chunk because it was just so good. But it's a good problem to have.
So I'll read just through the first part here, and then we can kind of unpack it, and then we'll read through the next part. Does that sound okay?
Do we want to read the opening quote?
Yeah, I was going to add that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So the chapter opens with this quote: "The socialists believe in 2 things which are absolutely different and perhaps even contradictory: freedom and organization." Eli Halevi. I don't know who that person is, but they are right in that quote. So here's the section. "Before we can progress with our main problem, an obstacle has yet to be surmounted. A confusion largely responsible for the way in which we are drifting into things which nobody wants must be cleared up. This confusion concerns nothing less than the concept of socialism itself. It may mean it being socialism, and is often used to describe merely the ideals of social justice, greater equality, and security, which are the ultimate aims of socialism." I'm going to read that again. So he's saying socialism may mean, and is being used to describe by a lot of these people, merely the ideals of social justice, greater equality, and security, which are the ultimate aims of socialism. But it means also the particular method by which most socialists hope to attain these ends, and which many competent people regard as the only methods by which they can be fully and quickly attained. In this sense, socialism means the abolition of private enterprise, of private ownership, and the means of production, and the creation of a system of planned economy in which the entrepreneur working for profit is replaced by a central planning body. There are many people who call themselves socialists, although they care only about the first, who fervently believe in those ultimate aims of socialism, like social justice, but neither care nor understand how they can be achieved, and who are merely certain that they must be achieved, whatever the cost. But to nearly all those whom socialism is not merely a hope, but an object of practical policies, the characteristic methods of modern socialism are as essential as the ends themselves. Many people, on the other hand, who value the ultimate ends of socialism, no less than the socialists, refuse to support socialism because of the dangers to other values they see in the methods proposed by socialists. This dispute about socialism has thus become largely a dispute about means, not about ends. Although the question whether the different ends of socialism can simultaneously be achieved is also involved. So let's stop there. There's a lot to unpack there that seems super prescient. And it's just like, this is the same argument that we've been having, that we've been having maybe even since Bernie Sanders, in terms of at least broke out in the surface, in the 2016 presidential campaign. It seems like the same argument.
Yeah. There's this really, really good quote that I think of here that I cannot remember who said it and it verbatim, but it's about vice and virtue, where vice is not the absence of virtue. It is just choosing one virtue above all the other ones. And this is what I think about when it comes to here. It's not that you're attempting to do something evil by implementing planning. You're not attempting to say, I want to hurt people. You are saying that we need to fix this one problem, whether it be some form of social justice or some other form of, war on poverty or something else. We must achieve this at whatever the cost. So what are you trading off by achieving that? And we get in more to this in the next chapter when it comes to specialists and these experts that we talk about.
Yep.
But it is the single-minded person who's focused on this one thing and they don't care about the costs of it. So I think, that's exactly what I think of when it comes to trying to use central planning to achieve a certain goal, because this goal has to be forced on the people. You have to get rid of the individual freedom, the individual liberty aspect in order to gain what you want for the collective. But the tricky little part is here, the collective is always going to be controlled by a central entity. So it's not really collective at all. It just claims to be. It forces these ideals onto the people rather than allowing them to choose their own ideals.
Yeah, exactly. And like you just said, it's being forced on people, hence the quote at the beginning. Socialists believe in two things that are probably contradictory, which is freedom and organization. You can substitute organization for planning there. And, whenever I say this is the argument that we've been having, to kind of sum up what Hayek was saying there, I know that was kind of a longer quote, but for people who are, listening or watching, he's saying, look, there are people who are saying socialism, and what they're not talking about a political system. They're not talking about a means of accomplishing something. They're just talking about what they want to happen. So in their minds, socialism is synonymous with social justice. Socialism is synonymous with equality. Socialism is synonymous with security. And so he's saying people are using this word to describe the things that they want to happen. And he's like, look, and this is where I'm like, this is the same argument where you hear these conservatives saying, we probably want the same things. We just disagree on how to get there and what's the best way to achieve these things. And so Hayek is saying, like, there are people who wholeheartedly agree with these ends that these advocates of socialism want, but they outright reject socialism. And I like how he says they refuse to support it because of the dangers to other values they see in the methods proposed by the socialists. And so, but what you see on this is primarily a left-wing phenomenon, is that, look, it's like, you don't agree with this policy, so therefore you're anti-woman or you're anti-black or something like that. You don't care about people. You don't care about kids. You don't care about these things. You don't care about the same values. And so that's where you get this like moralizing and moral posturing and bullying, where it's like, it's a complete straw man and defamation of character, where it's saying, okay, just because I don't agree with that this is the best way to do something, or even an intelligent or moral way to do something, like to say that I don't care about the ends is ridiculous, because I'm not saying we shouldn't want this. I'm saying that your way of getting it done is a bad way of getting it done. And so it's the same freaking argument that we have over and over and over again. Oh, you don't support the welfare, programs. You don't support these things and that thing. Oh, you don't care about poor people. You don't care about the inner city. You don't care about that. And it's like that rhyming. It's this freaking rhyming over and over and over again, where they use this moralizing language to bully people, to like make it seem like they're the bad guy. And what it does ultimately, so Hayek is saying this is about means, not about ends. And we have to have a conversation about means. But the people who are doing this, who are conflating these two things, are taking the conversation completely in a different direction than anything about ends or means. And it's all about like who you are as a person. You're a bad person. You don't care. You're immoral. You're an oppressive person. You're calloused and uncaring, because you don't agree with my ends. And so now the conversation shifts to, what are your how do you feel on the inside as a person? How compassionate are you? Instead of having some fact-based conversation about what's the best way to do this thing. Why are we talking about how much I care or don't care about people according to your assertion, instead of, hey, maybe school choice is a good idea and here's the arguments about it. You know what I mean? And so it just blows my mind how this is just a rehash of these same arguments that are dominating. It's the same people moralizing and grandstanding on these things. And in the meantime, the problems only get worse.
Yeah. I mean, the perfect example of this, which is something we align on and not necessarily you, the listener, might agree with, but it's, abortion. Like, we want to make sure that women have more autonomy, that they're able to enter the workforce and have the same rights as men. But the means to get there means you can abort a child. Like, you and I were like, we don't agree with those means. I don't. That
doesn't make any sense.
That's not a trade-off that we think is worth having. We actually find it to be extraordinarily immoral. So, that's an example of like, those means are evil, even if the ends are justified. And I want those ends too. I don't want a woman to not have the same opportunities that I do just because, something happened to her or she made a bad decision. Right. So to get into that next paragraph, which I don't think this would be enough to create confusion. You didn't read that paragraph yet, right?
I didn't. Can I just add one thing really fast that I think is worth adding there, is that I think it's fair to say that most of the people making these arguments don't realize they're having a different conversation. Most of the people who are, and I know I'm thinking of people, whether it's my past self before I, actually knew things, or people that I know, that most of the people who are having this argument about like, I can't believe you don't care about that, I can't believe that, don't realize that they're having a conversation that's different than the conversation we're having. We're having a conversation about like, I agree with you, what's the best way to do this? And they hear, you don't agree with how I want to do it, therefore you don't care about the ends. And I think this is a testament to the propagandizing and the really, really effective, really in a lot of ways brainwashing of these well-intentioned people, the very smart people, as James Lindsay would call them, useful idiots from the Soviet Union. This is a testament to the success of that, is that I think most of the people who make these arguments are largely making it in good faith, although maybe there's a willful ignorance involved there, and that it's not necessarily them intentionally trying to demagogue the issue, if that makes sense, just to try and be charitable to a lot of these people.
Absolutely. So to continue on the quote, this would be enough to create confusion, and the confusion has been further increased by the common practice of denying that those who repudiate the means value the ends. It's exactly what we just talked about here, is saying that if you do not agree with the means, even though we have the same ends, you're an evil person. This is the switch they have there, but it doesn't end there. So, but this is not all. The situation is still more complicated by the fact that the means, the economic planning, which is the prime instrument of socialist reform, can be used for many other purposes. We must essentially direct economic activity if we want to make the distribution of income conform to the current ideas of social justice. Planning, therefore, is wanted by all those who demand that production for use be substituted for production for profit. So production for use, that Hayek, I think, brought up a bit in the introduction, is a really, really common phrase that they used in the 1940s to switch out for production for profit. I don't really know. I haven't really heard many people talk about production for use, although through the back end, Bernie Sanders, AOC, you've certainly heard those people saying, look at these evil people who just want profit. we should demand that they use it for people who just need it and they don't worry about the profit. Like, take
climate alarmist, climate justice.
Well, the big one to me is healthcare. Healthcare is a huge one. It's like, why do you evil corporations want to make money? Well, they want to make money because they could turn around a vaccine in 9 months when it normally takes a year and a half at best. That is what the profit motive does for you. So, they're trying to eliminate that and substitute in this phrase that they used to use a lot called production for use. So continue quote, but such planning is no less indispensable if the distribution of incomes is to be regulated in a way in which to us appears to be the opposite of just. Whether we should wish that more of the good things of this world should go to some racial elite, the Nordic men, or the members of a party or an aristocracy, the methods which we shall have to employ are the same as those which could ensure the equalitarian distribution. So, good correction. So yeah, right there is this planning can be used for a lot of things that the planners are going to claim are just, but you can use it for some awful purpose. Think Germany in the 1940s, they used this for some evil, awful purposes that were used for a racial elite, creating more living space for the people who they deemed are properly fit to have kids, and expand the gene pool, and to eliminate those who weren't. So these planning authorities, because it's a centralized power and because it's not only used for the purpose that they say they want to use it for, but they can now expand this power to use it for now purposes as long as they're in. Again, Hitler was democratically elected. He was able to get in and claim that I want to make your life better. And then while he got that power, he's like, all right, I'm making all these other changes that, might make your life better depending on, how you're born or what you believe. So, to really caution yourself when you have anyone coming to you saying like, just give me a little bit more power and I can do all these things for you. That's going to make your life better.
Yep. Can I read the next quote here? Because I think and then we can synthesize like those two things, because I think the next quote is like exactly like what we're talking about. Yet, although to most socialists, only one species of collectivism will represent true socialism, it must always be remembered that socialism is a species of collectivism, and that therefore everything which is true of collectivism as such must also apply to socialism. It must also not be forgotten that socialism is not only by far the most important species of collectivism or planning, but that it is socialism, it is socialism which has persuaded liberal-minded people to submit once more to that regimentation of economic life, which they had overthrown because, in the words of Adam Smith, it puts government in a position where, to support themselves, they're obligated to be oppressive and tyrannical, end quote. So yeah, I think that's worth mentioning there, because it's like what you were saying, and that's an extension of that other part where he's like, look, you want these goals, you want social justice, you want all of these other things, but what you need to understand is that this is like this central planning and the socialism. This is collectivism. So you're wanting to use collectivism to achieve these means, and you need to look and see where are the other places where this ideology has been implemented to its logical conclusion, as like Ayn Rand would say, and what did it lead to? And he's like, look, the same means, which is planning here, that are used to create putting all of the good things to some racial elite, which would be the Nordic men, and with Nazism, or the members of a party or an aristocracy. Those are the same way that those things come to pass, which we would all agree are evil, are the same things you're wanting to use to ensure equalitarian distribution. And it's like it's the one ring. It's what was his name, Boromir in the first one. Wasn't Boromir in the first Lord of the Rings movie, where he's like, we can use it. We can use the ring for good, and it can't be done. He's saying, like, whenever you centralize all these things, and I know we'll get into this in later chapters, where it's like this leads to that's the thing over and over and over again. That's how he starts the chapter, right? We're drifting into things no one wants. No one wants. Real socialists, if they saw where this goes, would be appalled at the consequences of their ideas. And so Hayek is saying, look, like this is a disagreement about means, not about ends. The means that we want to use, us liberals in the true sense, we want to stay on the road that has brought us here in the first place. It's a slow process, but it's a process we know that leads to this. And there's this other, the road you're wanting to get on is a form of collectivism. It's the most important form of collectivism. And it's the same way in which, whether it's a racial elite or an aristocracy or a party or whatever, gains absolute power and control over a society and tyrannizes the hell out of its population afterwards. And it is wildly naive and irrational even to assume that you can go down that road and you'll be the exception, right? Like true tyranny has never been tried. Like true benevolent tyranny has never been tried, basically. And it's just a ridiculous idea.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you said before that, they implement the same strategy that they're fighting against. So to me, like, they try to get rid of the racial elite by creating a racial elite, and we'll get into later. They try to eliminate monopoly by creating a government-run monopoly. But I think of the anti-racism CRT stuff that's happening lately. Racism, uses racial discrimination. Non-racism tries to eliminate discrimination. Tries to say we don't care about this discrimination. It'll naturally go away when people know they can freely exchange with other people. Anti-racism brings back the racist idea of racial discrimination. It is using fire to fight fire, I guess, in that way, rather than water to fight fire, like a normal person would. So it is flipping this, and this is that. I mean, I bring up CRT because that's a part of social justice, which is explicitly what we're talking about here. Hayek understood that, what Marx started with trying to make everyone care about all these economic issues has now moved to kind of post-Marxism, where it has expanded to social issues, where you get social justice and all these other projects that these people want to work on and hammer down and create this new brand of equality, which is now equity, and control everyone's life via a central power, via that coercion.
Yeah, I mean, that's the Kendi quote, right? The only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination.
Yeah.
And so it's saying we need to use discrimination, get rid of discrimination, which of course is insane, insanely illogical.
And like we mentioned in the last episode, the thing is, these people, like they put this out there. They're not hiding the ball, totally. Especially the people at the thought leaders in this is like, they don't hide the ball. And believe in what they say. Don't try to take what they say and be like, well, what they probably meant was, a nicer version of whatever they're saying. Like, no, just believe in them. Trust them.
Yep. So I don't think we need to read all of this next quote to extract some ideas from it. But one of the things that we've mentioned before in previous episodes is that Hayek was actually charitable to his opponents' arguments almost to a fault. He was incredibly charitable to them. And he actually got criticism for that, being too charitable to some of these ideas. But he does a good job in the rest of this chapter because he's like, look, this is a disagreement about means, not about ends. And so like, we want to talk about like, what are your arguments? What are your concerns? What are the things that you're trying to do, that you're trying to accomplish? And what are the arguments you might have against us? And Hayek spends a good amount of time saying, I'm not arguing against government intervention per se. I'm not arguing against the existence of government. In fact, there are places in which you have to have this. And he quotes Adam Smith that, at one point, I think it was Adam Smith who says, there's no situation in which a government would do nothing. Which a reasonable person would think that the government would do, or would just sit and do nothing. And so like, we can get into that of where he's saying, and you just bolded that. So why don't you read that and kind of, piggyback on what you think is the most important part of this?
Yeah. So like you said, he's not against all forms of government intervention or regulation, but what he does want to parse out is really the argument against what he calls here the liberal plan, which is allowing individual freedom and the price system to plan out the economy. And so he goes here, this liberal plan, which I said, according to them, is no plan, and it is indeed not a plan designed to satisfy particular views about who should have what, right? So they're concerned that these individuals, like, how can they get together and figure out what's best for society? We ought to do that. A central authority ought to do that. To continue the quote, what our planners demand is a central direction of all economic activity according to a single plan, laying down how the resources of society should be consciously directed to serve particular ends in a definite way. That's what they want.
Yep.
The modern planner wants to say, you know what, this individual liberty stuff, you know, it's great and all this other stuff, but the plan that I want to accomplish has to be directed by a central authority. And
Yep.
that's important.
And
we can't rely on all these people to do what they want.
exactly. And one of the things later in the quote, which I think is important, is he says, the question is whether for this purpose it is better for the holder of coercive power should confine themselves in general to creating conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given the best scope so that they can plan most successfully, or whether rational utilization of our resources requires central direction and organization of all our activities according to some consciously constructed blueprint. So what he's saying there is, when he says holder of coercive power, that's government. Government has a monopoly on violence, right? That's the quote. And so he's saying there are these people who say, well, the government has a monopoly on violence. They have coercive power. And for them to not use coercive power to bring about the things that I think are most valuable, which again, we'll get into the experts and their very narrow and limited understanding of society here in a little bit. But he's saying they think that for the government to not get involved in these things constitutes no plan. And it goes back to what Hayek said in The Abandoned Road in chapter 1, where he says, look, the role of a liberal is like someone who has a garden. Like, you can't make the plant grow. All you can do is try to make sure that the environment and the setting is conducive for growth. But at some point, it's not up to you. You're there to try and make sure that the atmosphere is conducive for growth. And there are these people who say that's not a plan at all. You have coercive power. You need to use it and throw your weight around and throw your monopoly on violence around to accomplish all these things that I think are best. And you have to do it this way, or else you don't care. Like I said, it's about, should it be consciously directed to serve particular ends of a definite way. And so again, it goes back to, this is a conversation about means, not ends. And here he's saying there is people who say this should be top down by some benevolent, leaders who I guess are incorruptible in any way, but with absolute power. Or do you let this thing of, because what was the quote from, was it the 80s? Maybe earlier, I could be wrong, but it's like, is the economy stupid, or is the market stupid? And it's like, no, just because there is no one directing this thing doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense and it has a sense of harmony to it. Like, there's no one in the ocean directing schools of fish to go this way or coordinate in these, manners. But the ocean is a very logically constructed ecosystem with, different fish doing different things. There's coral reefs, there's a deep sea, all these other things. And it makes perfect sense. There is no, Aquaman, King of Atlantis down there making sure that these fish go and do this. That's true. That's true.
We've explored most of the ocean, man. I'm just saying.
It feels like a very
Jason Momoa might be down there.
That's right. It's like the evidence is inconclusive to the existence of Aquaman. But anyway, but the point is that these people see like people conducting mutually beneficial transactions without anyone, telling them how to do it and what they should value, as having no plan at all, which is crazy. And so they see, well, you have coercive power, you need to use it to accomplish my goals. And this goes back to collectivism. This is what collectivism is a top-down collective grouping everyone together and all the resources to follow some centralized plan and some centralized allocation of resources and values, which they don't think this is a hierarchy. When you prioritize this, then you're demoting all of these other things, and there are costs to these things. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So, and so he, we kind of mentioned at the beginning that he's not completely against government regulation, government intervention. I like his response to it. So I kind of paraphrase a little bit here, and then I have a quote coming in later, but I guess you can get into the paraphrase. What I wrote here is Hayek believes in free market economics, but understands that the proper response to socialist or collectivist proposals is not dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes. So the dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes is something that he puts in there. And that's something I think of when you think of like Ayn Rand. Like, I'm a conservative. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are pretty big fans of Ayn Rand, but I think she's got some significant flaws in her ideology. And I think the dogmatism of laissez-faire economics is one of those things, to say there's no room for any sort of government involvement at all, which I think that's certainly flawed. We're not going to get into here, but so I continue to say regulation via the government does have an important place in society. And then here's Hayek's thoughts on the main advantages of what he calls economic liberalism. So I'm going to quote from the book here. Economic liberalism regards competition as superior not only because it is in most circumstances the most efficient method known, but even more because it is the only method by which our activities can be adjusted to each other without coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. So this is the part that he gets into the competition, this what he calls the price system, which is a form of competition, is the best way to do things efficiently, but also the best way to adjust these activities to each other. When you have a central power, they don't normally worry about adjusting activities to much of anything except for their political goals, right?
Yep.
So they'll adjust just freely on there. But how often are those political goals going to line up with even a majority of people who voted that central authority in? It doesn't often do that. So the idea, this is the reason we want to maintain the free market and free enterprise, is because we're able to adjust our activities to each other via currency exchange and just free trade.
Yep. I mean, that's what Hayek calls the fatal conceit of socialism, which is that, and again, going back to that quote at the beginning of the chapter, it's that organization and freedom can coexist. And this idea that, what he calls that fatal conceit is like, okay, the bigger the plan, and the more centralized it is, then the more you have to limit those who disagree with the plan. You have to curtail them. You have to curtail their freedom. So you have to either silence them, you have to use coercion on them, or, you have to ignore them. But either way, whenever you are, again, this is a competition of ideals. And he gives an example, I think, in the next chapter of like cars and some other things of maybe you could do this, but all of these hypotheticals are so unworkable and so impractical that it's they're not even worth entertaining, and by no means even constitute the only way in which these things would happen. And so, but the point is that as you have this centralized plan, what do you do what if only 65% of the people want it? What do you do with the other 35%? And how limited are they? How much are you going to have to remove their freedom or their ability to do these things or participate in society in order to make sure this plan can be implemented? I mean, this goes back to the classic that we're not a democracy on purpose, at least in the United States. We're a constitutional republic because true democracy is mob rule. I mean, it is tyranny of a majority on a minority, full stop.
A nation of
and it
laws,
will always
not of
only
people.
be that. Exactly. And so you have to understand that. And whenever and that's why it's important to make sure that people have as much freedom to do the things that they want to do. And so the government's job is to maintain the ecosystem, not to tell them what they should and shouldn't care about. Because whenever you do that, it comes at a cost to someone who might have an entirely opposite perspective, which is something he gets into later. And one of the things I do kind of want to briefly touch on is I think this idea where he mentions that, laissez-faire, dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes towards the market. One of the things that I find myself at constant tension with is I've been reading and listening to a lot of this stuff about anarchism and these super libertarian guys like Mises and Rothbard and so on, that it's and I was listening to Michael Malice explain, I was telling you before we started recording, explain anarchism to this guy who was trying to understand. It's some Bitcoin guy. The way this guy was talking about Bitcoin made Bitcoin sound like a religion to some of these Bitcoiners, as he put it. I'm like, what the? Anyway. And so, but anyway, Malice had this idea of, because, Michael Malice is someone who, by the way, I respect a lot. I think The New Right's a fantastic book. I want to read his book on North Korea, Dear Reader. So I like the guy, and he's a person who I find myself agreeing with a lot of his presuppositions about the nature of things. But whereas I don't see his solutions as being workable, and maybe there are no solutions to some of these things, but where Malice would say something like, okay, because he's someone who thinks there should be no government, right? So this is something that Hayek is arguing against when he brings up dogmatic laissez-faire. And, you know, Malice would say, well, the idea that we need government, you know, so that we can have some kind of rules and regulations. He's like, well, what if you go into Macy's and you might have to have a car or some other like upscale department store? He calls it velvet rope. He's like, I'm a very big velvet rope proponent where, you know, places should be able to restrict who does and doesn't come in. And he's like, you might have to have a car to get in. Here's the section for this. If you want to do returns, you can't do it here. You have to do it over here. Here's the dressing rooms. You know, you go to this dressing room, you go to that dressing room. He's like, so there are rules that we all obey and agree to, and no one would say Macy's is a government. And the other example he uses, like eBay has a fantastic returns policy in case people get screwed and all these other things. And so these are private companies that do this, and we would not call either of these things government, and they don't require coercion to do that. And the main, you know, issue I have with that is these are all examples of things that exist within a society that has a robust legal framework, which is one of the things Hayek mentions later in the chapter. Is like, you have to have some form of government, some form of legal framework to address the areas where prices aren't doing it, aren't sufficient. You know, when it comes to like the environment stuff, we'll get into that. But the idea that like you can imagine a world without government or without any type of rules whatsoever based on institutions that exist within a world that does have laws and governments, to use us as examples is ridiculous to me. It's like you have to look at what did it look like in the places where there actually weren't governments, and it was this utopian thing where people were just, you know, dogmatic laissez-faire, as he puts it. You know, the example I think of is the Wild West. Whenever there was
Mad Max.
Mad Max. Well, I mean, Mad Max doesn't exist, but it was kind of like Mad Max.
Right,
but my point is
but
like,
that's
look
the
at the
example
places
they always use. This is what's going to happen
Right.
if we eliminate this thing.
Yeah, and it's like, well, no, maybe not Mad Max, but it's might be like, you know, New Mexico or Arizona or, you know, Colorado before they were states, you know, before whenever it was just people out there in the frontier. And that's why the term Wild West has a connotation that's like both negative and positive. The Wild West is like, it's the Wild West, man. Like people are doing whatever they want, but there's other times where people was like, we don't want this to be like the Wild West. Like you have to have some type of thing to make sure things don't get out of hand.
I've seen that movie. No, thanks. I don't want to have it turn into a Will Smith picture. Yeah.
The giant metal spider.
Yeah.
Save a Selma Hayek from the big metal spider. It's old school South Park reference.
Yeah.
But anyway, but just to address that, like Hayek is saying, like there has to be, and mostly I'm just kind of pontificating on what's my own internal things that I'm thinking about and trying to sort through right now. But that there does have to be some form of government here, and Hayek is advocating for that. So it's like we probably agree on a lot of the same things. It's just there's some very specific things like how much government with how much power to what ends. That distinction is not just important. It's the distinction. It's the distinction here.
Yeah. So I'm going to just continue on kind of the flip side. So a lot of the stuff you just mentioned now, I'm just going to quote from the book. So Hayek believes that there are some areas and examples in which a free market will function ineffectively. For example, quoting from the book here, is impractical to make the enjoyment of certain services dependent on the payment of a price. Competition will not produce services, think roads, road signs, and bridges, and the price system becomes similarly ineffective when the damage caused to others by certain uses of property cannot be effectively charged to the owner of that property. Think pollution, deforestation, and unethical farming techniques. So there are definitely some arenas there that
same arguments as today. Same things.
Exactly. But then he goes on to quote where we need to caution by going too far. So quote again, in such instances, we find some substitute for the regulation by the price mechanism, but the fact that we have to resort to the substitution of direct regulation by authority where the conditions for the proper working of competition cannot be created does not prove that we should suppress competition where it may be made to function. We do not, just because it works in this one place, just because we can coherently work to build an interstate does not mean we should be building every single, building in the entire country via a central planning board, right? We need to say that, okay, it works here, but what if competition can fill in this gap? Because it can do it more effectively. We know that. It can do it according to what people actually want, their needs. We know that. And this kind of is going to start to go into the next chapter. What happens when you say, you know what, I don't, a central planning board or the government just says, you know what, no, we're just going to have the government take care of this. This individual liberty aspect goes so far until, we find this one industry and then we want to take it over via central planning.
Yep. And I've seen, I think in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, articles from mainstream, corporate press. I like the distinction that Malice says. He's like, I don't want to call them mainstream media because a lot of the ideas they're putting out there are not mainstream ideas. Most people actually disagree with a lot of this. And so the corporate press, where it's like, is housing infrastructure? So they're talking about like Biden administration wants to do this big infrastructure bloated thing. I'm just going to get pissed if I go too much into it. But the point is that like, you're like that just because we can build a road, it doesn't mean that they should build every single building. And so they're like, it's housing infrastructure. And I think I also saw is childcare or pre-K childcare infrastructure, or something like we've seen these arguments like, is this infrastructure? It's like, no, a bridge is infrastructure. A road is infrastructure. A babysitter is not infrastructure, you lunatic. And so, but these are the arguments that people make where it's like, there's no logical endpoint to a lot of these arguments. In that same interview where, this might've been one that I posted where Malice talked to Jordan Peterson. He mentioned that like the WWJD, What Would Jesus Do thing was created by a Christian socialist. And the idea is that it's like, it's not about saving the soul of an individual, but it's about saving the soul of a country. And if it's about like the morality and the soul of a country, there is no logical endpoint to the scope of which government has in that thing, because it's like, it's the whole thing. There is no logical distinction between where the individual begins and the government ends, and vice versa. And so whenever there's these people like arguing for how all of this is infrastructure, how all of this is this, and this central planning thing, there's no, and by the way, it's that way on purpose, that there is no logical distinction between the individual and the government. And, where the government, what's that old, the saying, I think I mentioned it before in the last episode, is like, your right to swing your fist ends where my face begins. It's like the government's right to swing its fist also ends where our face begins. But under this ideology, there is that line isn't there, because the rights and the desires of the government, i.e. this bureaucratic elite, supersedes any rights and desires of an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to end this chapter, we have another quote here. I don't really think we need to get into this. I think we've kind of beat this one on the ground, but effectively, I mean, to read one of, or at least the beginning of the quote that I do think is important is the quote, "It is of the utmost importance to the argument of this book for the reader to keep in mind that the planning against which all our criticisms is directed is solely planning against competition, the planning which is to be substituted for competition. That is the planning we want to avoid. That is, something that if competition can work in that arena, it will always be more effective. And even if it's not always as effective as we want it to be, it doesn't advance as fast as we want it to be. It is much better than the alternative, which is government coercion."
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. So to kind of sum up this chapter 3, Hayek is making the point that, one, socialism is a version of collectivism. And as such, what collectivism does, every criticism of collectivism and every virtue, as such of collectivism applies to socialism. And, what he talks about at the beginning is the main argument people are having here. There's all these people who use socialism just as a stand-in or as shorthand for social justice or these things that they want, and don't think about it as a thing that actually does things, that requires certain policies and things to be put into place first. They just think, it's underpants gnomes. Again, it's like socialism ? Justice, socialism ? Equality. And so they just see it as equality, or as justice or social justice. And so his point here is like, there are all these people, myself included, yourself included, Hayek included, who actually agree that we should have a society that is just, a society that is fair, according to using definitions that are logical, not the definitions we hear today. And so, don't say that because we disagree with your means of getting there, i.e. socialism, that we don't care about the ends. That's completely ridiculous. And that was what was happening then. And that's what we're seeing today. This has been the same. It's just, blowing up this kind of moral grandstanding. and demagoguing these issues. And he goes on to steelman, what some of those criticisms might be, what are the valid criticisms and where they might fall apart. And he does try to find common ground by saying, look, I'm not arguing for no government. I'm not arguing for no planning. That doesn't make sense. I'm arguing that there can't be a top-down total total planning, like you said at the end, against competition. We have to plan for competition, around competition, but we can't, have this top-down thing and assume it's going to lead to social justice or whatever, because it's actually probably going to lead to tyranny and destruction of rights. I don't know if you'd add anything else to that. I don't feel like that was a very good summary, to be honest. But
no, I mean, it's hard to summarize even one chapter of this book in a way that seems sufficient to cover all these profound things he said. But I do think that this is one of those chapters that a lot of his critics didn't seem to read, if they read it at all. And that's what he brings up a lot in the introduction, especially in the American version, where, the pushback against it in America was just as strong as the people who advocated for it. Because again, the big difference here between the European release, which was in 1944, they went through socialism. They understand what it is. They actually had it in practice. And then it came out into American paperback version in 1956, where America did not have this in practice. They did not have the experience of collectivism, at least not at the scale. Certainly had, the New Deal and all those collectivist policies, but they didn't have it in the same way that Europe had it. So the reaction to this book was either really, really high, where a lot of people that he said, like, I don't agree with the people who are praising me because they're using this version of dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes to praise this book and saying that I agree with all these things and government should set up everything. That's not what I'm saying. And then on the opposite side, where they say, if government wants to build a sidewalk, that's socialism. That's not what he's saying either. And both those are unfair. And this is a perfect chapter to really understand. And I like what you say there. He, as opposed to straw manning, which so many books do, their opposition, he does quite literally steel man their position to make sure that he's being as generous to them as possible, which makes it even a better book because it helps you understand this balance of both sides a bit more. And this makes it more relatable now.
Totally. So let's get into chapter 4. I don't think this will be as long as chapter 3, but I want to read this first part. And there's this one quote in here I think is the most relevant, and we could do a whole episode and probably 10 just on this one quote and all the examples of it. But so chapter 4 is called.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I didn't know if you're going to hit the title. So the title is super important here.
Yeah. So chapter 4 is called The Inevitability of Planning, because one of the arguments that Hayek was seeing promulgated over and over and over again was people were saying, look, this is inevitable. Like, this is just what happens. Like, this is the natural evolution of capitalism. Like, and if you don't think this is where we have to go, then you're totally wrong. Because there's other people saying, actually, what's going on in Nazi Germany is a natural outgrowth of capitalism. And we don't want to be Nazis. And so planning is what's going to rescue us, from Nazism, which is, of course, insane. But so he's addressing people who think this is inevitable. It's what we have to do. It's just become an axiom. It's what we have to do. It's kind of like, systemic racism today. It's like people just say it or assert it, as such, as a metaphysic or something, that without necessarily trying to prove it. So the quote is, it is a revealing fact that few planners are content to say that central planning is desirable. So they don't just say this is what we want. Instead, they say most of them affirm that we can no longer choose, but are compelled by circumstances beyond our control to substitute planning for competition. So not competition, we're going to have planning instead. The myth is deliberately cultivated that we are embarking on the new course, not out of free will, but because competition is spontaneously eliminated by technological advances, which we can neither reverse nor should wish to prevent. Of the various arguments employed to demonstrate the inevitability of planning, the one most frequently heard is that technological changes have made competition impossible in a constantly increasing number of fields, and that the only choice left to us is between control of production by private monopolies and direction by the government. So monopoly of corporations or monopoly of government. It's the only choice we have. False binary. This belief derives mainly from the Marxist doctrine of the concentration of industry. Although, like so many Marxist ideas, it is now found in many circles which have received it at third and fourth hand and do not know whence it derives. That's the end part there. It's like, Can I get an amen? This idea
Hallelujah.
that this is inevitable. Yeah, hallelujah. This idea that planning is inevitable, that capitalism leads to concentration of wealth at the top and leads to these monopolies, through technological advances. So we don't want to stop technological advances, but it's going to lead to these monopolies. And so we have to do something about that. And so this is inevitable. And Hayek is saying, also, by the way, this is Marxism. And so all these people arguing for it are arguing, one of Marx's ideas about this, concentration at the top. But like so many of Marx's ideas. So Hayek is saying, so this is, when he first started, this was in the 30s, and then now when it's published in 44, where he's saying, like so many of Marx's ideas, he's seeing it then too. People are getting it third and fourth hand, and they don't know they're arguing for Marxism, which is, again, even then is a testament to how well this ideology was able to insert itself and hijack so many other good things like liberalism or something like that, or freedom or liberty or equality. So people had no idea they're arguing for Marxism. But he's saying, like, as an aside, this is Marxist, and you have no idea you're arguing for Marxism. But let's address this notion that this is inevitable.
Yeah. I mean, I also do like the part you bolded, just because so many people don't understand the talking points. Like, that's the problem with talking points, is they sometimes come from really bad people who you probably don't want to associate yourself with. So I think of like the big lie. They're attributing that to Trump. Yeah. They don't understand they're mimicking a Nazi talking point made famous by Hitler. It's like, probably work on your branding a bit there. But
I would argue it's very on brand.
Oh, wait, yeah. I mean, probably not what they want, but I mean, truth comes out in various different ways, I suppose. But yeah, so it is amazing that people don't really understand the kind of origins of a lot of their talking points, of where that comes from. I also loved the part with the technological changes. I mean, he really harps on the technological aspects in this part of the book. The options of having a free market monopoly versus, instead of the argument against a free market monopoly always tends to be a public monopoly. Like that, those are your two options. And you say that's a false binary. And there's a third option that, they did, I don't remember if it's the early 1900s or 20, I don't remember when it was, but when the Luddites were around and they were bashing up all the equipment because they were scared that this equipment's taking my job. And, that's another option there that we don't want to use. But we got to stand back and realize, and there's another quote here that goes on monopolies, is like, how do they form? Like, there's this big, in the 20th century, there's this big scare of monopolies and how they form. And I think he goes on here. So if I can continue with the quote.
Go for it.
Anything else? So he quotes here, it should be noted, moreover, that monopoly is frequently the product of factors other than lower costs of a greater size. So when you think of monopoly at lower cost or greater size, think Amazon, right? They're able to ship out all these parts because they have so many logistic lines that allow them to get all this product normally at a higher cost. I think like big stores like Costco, at a higher volume, you're able to sell things at a lower cost, but that is not really the factor that creates monopolies here. So he continues by saying, it is attained through collusive agreements and promoted by public policies. When these agreements are invalidated and when these policies are reversed, competitive conditions can be restored. So what he's saying here is, more often than not, monopolies are not created in a free market. They're created in the absence of a free market. They're created by colluding with the government. Amazon has no issue, and I'm not here to pick on Amazon. They're a great company. I use them all the time. But Amazon, an example of someone, when you talk about fight for 15, like they're like, I'm all for it. Like you think that our competitors, our little mom and pop shops that can't utilize these logistical lines like we can, you think they can survive at $15 an hour to pay their high school kids? Like, they can't. So all you're doing is helping us eliminate competition. That's one way that you see the free market get in bed with public policymakers to eliminate this competition. And we got to think about it this way. Does this policy help competition or eliminate it? And when it eliminates it, we need to at least look at the underlying facts and say, what are the means to get to this end? And that's why people, like I imagine you do, and I do, I'm not for a fight for 15, because the means to get there are not worth the ends.
Totally. Well, I'm not for any minimum wage, but yeah, absolutely. I would fight for zero. But
zero, as Thomas Sowell says, the minimum wage is always zero.
Yep, exactly.
You can get fired.
Yep. So anyway, but yeah, and so like he's addressing this. So much of well, it's in the title of the chapter, but so much chapter 4 is about, quote, inevitability, what's inevitable, what isn't. And he's like, here are the things you're theorizing are inevitable, right? And let's look at the things that actually are inevitable based on evidence where we've seen it. And he's like, so where we've seen it, the evidence is that monopolies form actually not from a free market, but from collusion with the government. So that's what is probably inevitable, is that there. Your theories of what are inevitable are technology advances, and it's going to lead to, consolidation at the top and lead to lack of competition. And so it's going to lead to monopolies, and just a few thoughts on that is like, okay, so at the end of the 18th century, right, like 1790s, Thomas Malthus says, hey, look, we're making all these short-term gains and progress, but we're going to have massive starvation and food shortages here before long, and so he had this idea of this is inevitable. So we have to do something. The government has to do something, and no such thing happened, and the same arguments against technology and like, the government has to get involved because technological growth is going to destroy all these industries. The Henry Ford quote is, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And, there's this idea that the consumers and that the market a lot of times, or not the market, but just consumers generally are really good at describing problems, but they're not so good at figuring out what the solutions are. That's what the market is for. That's what entrepreneurship and freedom and industry is for, is figuring out those solutions. Henry Ford's like, I know what people's problem is. They need a faster way to get around. And so it's not that they need a faster horse, they just need a faster way to get around. And so these people have this idea that technology and stuff leads inevitably to monopolies. It's like, no, freedom leads to technology, and technology leads to more advances in freedom and more methods of people to prosper, and then to also explore their own entrepreneurial and innovative avenues as they see fit. Again, the airplane was invented by these bicycle shop owners, the Wright brothers. And so they have this concept of inevitability. And by the way, we've seen this argument today, right? People say about self-driving trucks. So this is what Andrew Yang was all about in this last. Self-driving trucks are going to kill the trucking industry. That's why we have to have UBI. It's like, I don't hear anyone talking about that anymore. You know why? Because I don't see any self-driving trucks dominating the highways. Like maybe they will, maybe they're somewhere, but for something that was such a terrible emergency, that self-driving trucks, this is going to happen. We have to have UBI. I'm not hearing anyone talking about it. So it's like, okay, either you're wrong, which you should address, or you're lying, which we should address, right? But either way, it's like this argument that technology or all these things are inevitable, and so the government has to do something there. It's like that's not the case. But again, it's the rhyme. It's the same arguments, just in a different context, that this will lead to monopolies. And so once again, like Hayek is laying out, okay, so we have a road that we can look back and we can gather empirical, concrete evidence, make surface level, like face value observations about what this did. Liberalism, freedom. We can have mutually beneficial transactions between each other. What did that create? And so let's look at evidence. And then there's these other people who are like, let's theorize in fantasy land about what is inevitable. We're just going to assert these things as axioms, like he says. It's just repeated over and over again, and it's assumed to be true, but it's a dubious assertion at best. And oftentimes, you don't know where the ideas come from, Marx in this case. And he's like, so you're taking what you think is going to happen, that you're just asserting to happen, and with no evidence, but just because you feel it or because you feel strongly about it, or you can say it really loudly, and you're trying to put that as a viable alternative, or even or worse, a superior alternative to what we do have evidence of that works, and what actually is inevitable. And here's what's inevitable under the system you're proposing, right? Here's where this actually leads. And it's completely afactual, and it just shows the utopian and delusional nature of a lot of these ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, some of them are more sinister than that, I'd say. So there's the quote here, and I'll paraphrase the beginning of it, but it's like, the belief that technological advances like this necessitate planning is absurd as a claim, and I'll quote here, implied in a statement by Mussolini that Italy had to abolish individual freedom before other European people because its civilization had marched so far in advance of the rest. That's the claim here. It's like, man, we're so advanced. We gotta break the shell of individual freedom, because that's the old way of doing things. Now the new evolved form of doing things is to do this type of planning, and to take the liberty away and introduce a central planning board, or a central.
What's the quote from Mussolini at the beginning of the chapter? He has a quote.
Yeah.
This
Yeah,
I think there's a direct quote from Mussolini. You should read that,
he's
because
quoted
this
him a
isn't,
few times.
yeah, this isn't Hayek speculating here about Mussolini bragging about getting rid of freedom,
Yeah.
you know, in the name of progress. This
Yeah.
is a direct quote.
Yeah. So a quote from Benito Mussolini. We were the first to assert that the more complicated the forms assumed by civilization, the more restricted the freedom of the individual must become. So that's, I mean, that's the central idea of fascism, right? So, you know, yeah, you gotta.
The more complicated it is, the more you got to have Big Brother telling you how to do it, telling you how to navigate it. I mean, this is the argument that, you know, comes to my mind is, and of course is racist and idiotic, but it's like, you know, getting an ID is too complicated. Black people don't know how to go and get an ID or don't know how to use the internet, you know, that we're hearing from the Democrats. And it's like, this should piss people off so much because of how racist and absurd these notions are. But it's like, this is so complicated. Let us take care of it. Let us take care of it. And we're going to take care of it by getting rid of any, you know, voter ID or any type of, you know, system around making sure that we have integrity around our elections and other things. But that's the thing. It's, oh, this is too complicated. The more complicated it is, the more you got to let us handle it, because, you know, you stupid plebs, you know, could not possibly understand, you know, the ins and outs of this complex society like we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mussolini, by the way, was praised heavily by, I'm trying to remember what the guy's name is, who was a part of FDR's administration and helped shape the New Deal. I'll think about it here in a little bit. But one of FDR's main advisors visited Mussolini, obviously pre-World War II, and loved what was going on in Italy and said, he's one of the people who's responsible for or advocated for the Federal Reserve, and then also, well, like I said, the New Deal. He wrote that this is what we should be doing. Everything Mussolini is what we should be doing. Mussolini was saying, we got to get rid of freedom. And that's FDR. That explains the New Deal. That explains that progressivism in the mainstream United States. I remember Tugwell. His name was something Tugwell. He went there. It's in his journals praising this fascist dictator, saying we need this in America.
I mean, he deserves, I guess, a little bit of praise. Mussolini is the most unfortunate person, I think, in the history of anything, because he's an evil piece of garbage, but didn't even get like the recognition that Hitler got. Like, he's just like in the background, just like, I wish I was more famous because, you know, I did awful things. But yeah, he got what he deserved, I suppose. But if we can move on with the monopolies and all this stuff, you know, I have another quote here that it kind of the flip side of monopolies, and I'll explain after I quote it here. There is yet another theory which connects the growth of monopolies with technological progress, and which uses arguments almost opposite to those we have just considered, though not often clearly stated. It has exercised considerable influence. It contends that not that modern technique destroys competition, but that, on the contrary, it will be impossible to make use of many of the new technological possibilities unless protected against competition is granted, i.e. a monopoly is conferred. So he talks about this in the form of protectionism. We must protect this newer technology that we want to grow. So, you know, I think of here the government subsidizing, protecting via other government regulations on solar and wind power technologies, right? These are technologies that they want to implement, this green energy movement, that these technologies are just not efficient enough. In reality, they're just not efficient enough, and that's why they don't work. And they all often use a lot of fossil fuels, which is what they're trying to replace to create them, ironically. But it is government trying to pick this winner and doing everything they can, which means subsidizing the technologies and also punishing people for using the more traditional technology like fossil fuels. So it is government trying to create the monopoly, trying to dampen competition in order to pick the winner that they get. And also, just, a lot of these people are making a lot of government money, which government money just translate to our tax dollars, right? That are being subsidized to companies that they're more friendly with. So just got to see the corruption inside of that side of planning as well.
Yeah, to go into your exact example, because one of the things I thought of is I remember, like, this is one of the parts about, by the way, like, getting red pilled is it's like, okay, I have to go back and relearn like what actually happened for the last everything. And so, but if you can look up, so Barack Obama used a lot of taxpayer dollars to fund all these green initiatives, because, hey, we got to protect them. We got to confer special benefits to them. Not like, again, the market has deemed they don't work, but we know they will, and so let's try it out. And there's an article from the Daily Signal that has 34 companies that are either bankrupt or about to go bankrupt. This was written in 2012, by the way, under Barack Obama's like green energy initiatives that they received taxpayer subsidies from the government. And so this is all the way from like 25 million, 13 million, 2 million, 5 million, 500,000, 100 million. And so there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 companies on that list had filed for bankruptcy whenever that happened. So the point is that there are these people, these benevolent, top-down advocates who are like, well, no, the government has to, we can decide. We're smarter than the market, right? The market's stupid. So we have to tell them what works and what doesn't. And so we're going to spend taxpayer dollars on these things. And it's like, well, if it had worked, and this is the problem with the top-down thing, what Hayek says is it's not responsive. It's always playing catch up, because prices and success and failure of things it's just baked into it. It's not that nothing is happening. It's that you have to understand you have to learn how to interpret what the market is saying. And in some cases, for sure, there is corruption. In some cases, for sure, there is like people driving other things out of business. I think the Tucker mobile, the vehicle where there's the automobile wars, I'm trying to think when the Tucker was. It was like maybe the 40s or 50s that had all these innovations. And then there was these car companies, Ford and who was the other big one? Ford and Chevy, right? Get together and GM get together to try and push Tucker out of business, sabotaging stuff. They made a movie about it. Anyway, doesn't matter. But I think some of the claims in that movie were dubious. But either way, they're absolutely, monopolies do these things. That's what a cartel is, right? When monopolies work together. But the point is that if you don't listen to the market, you're gonna have these people trying all these things, spending billions of taxpayer dollars on things because it's like, I'm just gonna make it work. I'm gonna force it to work. Like, and it still doesn't work. All those companies went bankrupt. You were talking about, so I just Googled green energy initiative failures under Obama, and the Daily Signal article is the first one that came up. So I could be wrong there. But I've heard Shapiro talk about that before, and others who were like, no, like they refused to listen to the market. They asserted this stuff from the top down, and you can't make it work. Like you can't, your desire for a thing to work has no bearing on its workability. I could want square wheels on cars to be a thing all I want, but that will not manifest in those being a good idea, just because I want it to work. I think it's a good idea, or that I think it should work.
I think those are block tires on Canadian cars. I don't know.
That's right. South Park.
Another South Park reference.
Yep.
This episode sponsored by South Park. But so there's just and we're going to get into it more in a little bit. I'm surprised, actually. It seems like a lot of these quotations are based on monopolies, but they make it's super important to the thesis of the book to understand how eliminating this type of competition, and also eliminating the competition and then blaming the competitors on it. Like that's the little switch that they do. They say, oh, this market is not working. There's a monopoly created because of the things we did. Therefore, the people in that marketplace are doing it wrong. We need more power. I mean, that's the little switcheroo they turn around.
Let's deviate just for a second here to talk about this kind of middle way. I don't think it was in the notes there, but what brought to my mind is let's address, because he talks a lot about democratic socialism and people trying to wed socialism with democracy, and coming up with this middle way, this third way, by the way, which is what Hitler talked about, was creating a third way. But and he says, okay, let's look at how this will play out naturally. Is that whenever you implement these policies to protect these interests, you create monopolies in the free market. Then once these monopolies are created in the free market, the government then has to assume control of them, because they can't allow them to continue. So then now the government has the monopolies, and the government will not, the only thing, and once the government has monopolies, it only makes sense for them to get rid of all of the rest of the competition, because they have to, the idea behind regulation is you have to have authority over that which you're regulating. And so the government, once it has taken over the private monopolies, will then have to consolidate the rest. Otherwise, the plan doesn't work, right? That's how planning works. Everything has to be on board, and we're going to push out anything that disagrees. So then now the government controls this thing, and now we're back to the thing that you said you were trying to avoid. And so that even this creation of private monopolies under these, counterintuitive programs will necessitate the government getting involved. Now the government has a monopoly, and now the government has all the power. And this is, again, planning against competition, not planning for competition, because it all inevitably gets rid of competition.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's I think one last little bit here on monopolies and how, this quote is going to go into a lot of what I think of, because I wrote a whole, 3-series piece on healthcare, and I was trying to steel man the idea of universal healthcare. And this is government involvement. This is government eliminating competition in the industry of healthcare in order to fill in their own version of universal healthcare. And the switch that they do there is it's kind of like, this thing is so great. Let's just take it over because it's good enough now. If anyone who advocates for something like universal healthcare, they're like, we already have all these cures. Like, why do we need to create profit off of it? It's like, well, if you'd have had this idea 100 years ago, imagine all the cures we wouldn't have right now, because you want to get rid of the profit motive.
They see it as it's what Hayek said. Sorry to interject there, but think about it in the beginning chapter when he's like, they see they don't understand that the things they're wanting to get rid of are the very systems that created and maintain this right now. Right. So, and it's really the other side of what Malice is trying to say. It's like, I can just conceptualize anarchy within a thing that works really well in a system that is the opposite of it. Like, no, that's not how that works. And so these people are like, I can conceptualize a system of total government control and lack of competition within a system that was built on the opposite of that. Right. Like, you can't do that. You can't divorce the prosperity we have now from the means by which we achieved it. That's not how that works. It's a foundation, not a scaffolding.
Yeah. It's a Henry Ford idea of, I would have given everyone a horse and buggy if I would have done what I wanted to do. But it is that,
what they thought they wanted.
Yeah. Or if, we make it right, or we make transportation a human right, we would all get a horse and buggy, which would be awesome, except for 100 years later where we would all have 2 cars. It's just that is the short-sighted thinking that has planning completely destroy the market and really prosperity in general. To pull this quote in here. In much of the current discussion on the effects of technological progress, this progress is presented to us as if it were something outside, I believe it's outside us, which could compel us to use the new knowledge in a particular way. So I use us a lot. So here's the big one. While it is true, of course, the inventions have given us tremendous power, it is absurd to suggest that we must use this power to destroy our most precious inheritance, liberty. This is when I think about healthcare, is like, we've built up this insane infrastructure of healthcare where, there are cures that people would have died of diarrhea, 200 years ago. Whereas now it's just like, you just take something at home or you use a modern bathroom and you'll survive, and you have all these liquids available to you. Like, so there's all these things that we have now. And we've seen the road we took to get to this progress. Why would you veer off that road now? This doesn't make any sense. You're using that power to destroy itself effectively. To continue the quote, it does mean, however, that if we want to preserve it, we must guard it more jealously than ever, and that we must be prepared to make sacrifices for it. While there is nothing in modern technological developments which forces us towards comprehensive economic planning, there is a great deal in them which makes infinitely more dangerous the power a planning authority would possess. So that's the big one. It is none of these changes is forcing us to go to a planned model. We're using the road we took to get there. And to make this complete switch, this about face, we're just taking a completely new road here to what we think is the great utopia. We have now just made this much more dangerous. We made these efficient technologies in the power of the wrong people who want to accomplish their own goals. That's going to be much more dangerous to the people who would be prospering from them if we maintain our path down this road.
Yeah. Excellent quote. And like, to tease out the wrong people, I've used this example in education before, and you see this all over the place, where in order for people to assume something bad is going to happen, they often assume that bad motives have to be involved. And so But if they can look at, and this is how a lot of these arguments are made, right? If a person can argue that their motivations are good, their intentions are good, that they care a lot, then there's no way that a bad outcome could occur, or even a evil or malicious or destructive outcome could occur, because the intentions are so good. And that's not what Hayek is saying. He's saying that society is way more complicated than the tunnel vision ends of certain people who might have good ideas or good motives, but you can't give them uniform control over things, because that will come at a tremendous cost, to go back to chapter 3, of other values, namely liberty and freedom, and the very means in which the society gains so much prosperity and technological advances, both in just science and other technologies in the first place, from science and medicine to toys, as Hayek mentioned, I believe, in the introduction. And so either way, the wrong people isn't necessarily evil people. In fact, evil people are very rarely involved on the onset of these things. They're the ones who take over at the end. And that's what he gets into later in the book, is that it's the well-intentioned people who put this into place. And once it's there, go, I'm out. And then the evil people were like, I'm in. Thank you for, creating this system for me to exploit everyone else. And also, you're up against the wall and shot now. And I think you had a really good, so let's get into that quote about, did you have the quote in there about the experts?
Yes. So the next one will be about, so this is the part where we transition
let's end it with this.
Yeah.
Because this is so good. Yeah.
Well, so this is the part where he transitions. So there's two main points to chapter 4. There's monopolistic behavior and how it's used by people who create the monopolistic behavior to create more planning, to centralize more power. And the next part is the idea of experts, which is, when I started listening to this originally, is like, wow, this is brilliant. So I don't know if you want to take the quotes. I got all the fun ones before.
Why don't we I think we could probably sum it up, because what I was talking about is the quote, which I didn't see it here, is where he talks about, like, there's a person who cares about the environment. There's a person who cares about history. There's a person who cares about advancement. And so one of the things that Hayek is saying there, so Hayek gives us examples. So to kind of, Kevin and I just talked about a lot of stuff that we know what we're talking about. You guys are like, okay, wait, slow down. So whenever he gets into, and why I mentioned, like, put that asterisk next to the wrong hands or the wrong people, how it doesn't imply malicious intent. It doesn't imply some nefarious actor. It just implies a limited understanding of the way things work. And so Hayek gives this example of, like, these people could be experts on these things. And one of the things he says is that, like, we all have this picture in our mind, that, especially if you're an expert on something, that's like, if we had a conversation and you were a rational person, I could convince you of my perspective. We all have this idea of, like, everything I believe is rational and reasonable, and it's held up by evidence. And if you're another rational and reasonable person, I could persuade you to my point of view. But the problem is that you have that same opinion. And so what do we do whenever we get into a situation where you just have different values than I have? And so Hayek gives the example of, like, okay, so let's say there's an expert on the environment, and they're like, we don't want pollution. We don't want these, like, decrepit, like houses with asbestos and all this other stuff in the countryside. Like, we have to deal with that. And then there's these people who care about, like, history, and, like, no, we want to keep this picturesque, cottage, and this, countryside. We don't want you to tear down any of that. And then there's the industrialist who's like, I care about technology and I care about growing and advancing society. So I want to create factories, or, I want to do these things. And so there are all these people, and his highest point is, all of those people are arguing for planning. All of them are arguing for planning, and they don't have any concept in their mind of, if there's 100 people in a room who are all saying we need planning, every single one of them on some level has a very different picture of what planning is and what it will lead to. And they all have different priorities. And so this idea that we're going to have this top-down centralized direction of resources and of the economy via planning, it is unworkable unless you are totally okay with curtailing the values and the freedom and the liberties of other people. Because, as I mentioned before we started recording, is like, Thomas Sowell says economics is not a system of, like, providing and creating things, but it's a system of rationing. There is a finite number of everything, in the world, and and the only thing there's an infinite number of is demand. And so he says there's supply for milk, the supply for this thing, the supply for steel is all limited. And economics is the system that uses, it's basically rationing to make sure that the people who want the thing the most, at least most times, get the thing. Because there's an infinite demand and a limited supply. And that also goes when you have this top-down thing. What happens if you have all these people that it's like, I want to focus on this, I want to focus on this, and do that at the expense of these other interests? And I thought you had an excellent example of that in those notes there, those we're talking about. But I mean, if I missed anything there,
no,
please feel free to add. But
Thomas
I think
Sowell,
your example is amazing.
Yeah. So this is a big thing Thomas Sowell harps on, which actually would translate really well here is, we have finite resources, but we have an infinite amount of value. There is no zero sum game when it comes to value. And that's what an economy is supposed to provide, is this productive value that you keep increasing that allows more prosperity to more people. When you take this free market idea of a zero sum game and put it into a planned economy, you have now created a zero sum game for that value, because they have to quantify it, because they're the only ones in control of the game here. So that is the most destructive purpose of injecting any sort of government into what could be a competitive marketplace. But when he talks about the technical experts here, you hit it on the head that they're specialists in their own field and they want their own things. And when you talked about before about the well-intentioned people in this arena that can do bad things, that is exactly the specialist. He had a quote here that it is the frustration of his ambitions being the expert, the specialist in his own field, which makes the specialist revolt against the existing order. This is what frustrates those people. It's their ambition that can cause a lot of damage, because they're the ones who are told, like, all right, you got to get this one thing done, and they know this one thing really well, and they're going to do it at the expense of other things. So the exact idea, or the exact person that I thought of here, is Dr. Anthony Fauci. Is an example of an expert, a specialist who is single-minded in his approach to defeating something being COVID, and he defeated, or wanted to defeat, this virus at any cost, which those costs were social and economic costs that were extremely damaging. So economic, obviously, the forced shutdown of the country is extraordinarily damaging to not only America, but the world, because everyone had to deal with this virus, and also a lot of people rely on America for a lot of different things. So shutting down the economy really hurt. And then the social effects of it, I told right before we started recording the idea of having masks on. I think we have a problem with social media, because the biggest problem with social media to me is socializing with people without actually interacting with them personally. Because a lot of what we do is translated in communication, translated via our bodies and what we do, and the social cues that are extremely important, that we've used our whole entire human lives to communicate with each other. There's a Joe Rogan quote that he's like, they were talking about reading each other's minds, and if that's possible, and Joe Rogan's just like, well, yeah, we read each other's minds every day. Noise comes out of our face and I can tell what's in your head. That is reading each other's minds. But an important part of that is being able to read the social cues on your face. So wearing a mask eliminates a lot of that type of communication. And now we need to change, just like we had to change with social media, and we saw the negative effects of social media, especially on the younger generation, changing this, eliminating, those facial expressions via the mask is extremely damaging. So I had to have a conversation with my daughter, who's 8 years old. We're fully vaccinated. We're in a really progressive part of the Midwest. So, it's kind of a thing we almost had to do, but obviously the kids didn't have to. And she's in the car putting her mask on. I'm like, you don't have to put your mask on. But she's like, oh, Dad, I'm used to this. Like, why wouldn't I? Like, there's still COVID out there. I'm like, because you don't, like, people, it's a good thing to see. It was hard for me to explain the social cue aspect. Like, people need to know you're smiling. Like, it was hard for me to communicate in a grocery store and kind of when you let someone pass or let someone go through the door in front of you, you kind of have that smile, but now I'm just kind of staring at them weird and they kind of don't know what I'm thinking. There's that important social aspect to letting people see your face. And she's like, well, I feel like I've been wearing this mask my whole life. It feels like, a lot of development of her life, and that is extraordinarily damaging for a generation who's gonna be like, well, I grew up doing this. Why wouldn't I just keep doing this? And that's something that was implemented by these experts, by the people that said, at any cost, we need to defeat this virus and save lives at the expense of harming lives down the road, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of the conversation last year and where you hear people talking and asking Fauci, or they bring him in front of, Congress or whatever. And he says, look, I'm a virologist. I'm here to think about these things in terms of virology. And there are people who were, and I think Deborah Birx said the same thing. And people, of course, criticized Trump for saying, I'm going to listen to these people. I'm also going to listen to economists and everyone. We have to weigh the various costs and effects here. And Fauci and Birx straight up said, our job was not to consider what we thought needed to be done in the scope of an economy or the education system or all of these other things. That was not the context in which we were seeking to address this. We had basically a one factor here of virus spread mitigation. That's it. We're not thinking about anything else because that's not our jobs. And that's why Hayek says that's the most dangerous person, really. I don't know if we got to that part of the quote, but where he says that those people are the most dangerous. I think he says it would make this is not to underrate the here. I'll just read this quote because it's relevant. It says the movement for planning owes its present strength largely to the fact that while planning is still the main ambition, it unites almost all single-minded idealists, all the men and women who devote their lives to a single task, i.e. Anthony Fauci. The hopes they place in planning, however, are the result not of a comprehensive view of society, but a rather very limited view, and often the result of a great exaggeration of the importance of the ends they place foremost. This is not to underrate the great pragmatic values of this type of men in a free society like ours, which makes them subject of just admiration. But it would make the very men who are most anxious to plan society the most dangerous if they were allowed to do so, and the most intolerant of the planning of others. What I want, I'm intolerant of what you want because what I want's the best. And he says, from the saintly and single-minded idealist to the fanatic is often but a step. And he gave that quote about it's the frustrated person in their field who most wants planning. And so the point is that like, these are the people that are most dangerous, that you don't want them to have total control of society because they have a limited understanding of society. So Anthony Fauci is like, I'm not an economist. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not thinking about this from an economic standpoint. Whether if you put an economist in charge, they might say, I don't want to have any regard for the virus, and so I'm going to do all these other things. And so the point is, you have to allow for the input and the freedom of all of these different people who have unique and specialized understanding in their various fields. Like take an educator, for example, like a good one, not the people who are most often found in classrooms these days, but who they're going to say, we need to have kids in the classrooms. We need to have kids back in schools. We're often the first point of contact to learn about abuse and neglect in the home. And so by keeping kids out of schools, there's a lot of abuse and neglect that is going unreported. And so you have to have all of these voices, but when you only have a limited, like a person with a limited scope or limited, maybe you say like priority in mind, they'll tunnel vision on that. And like you mentioned, like at any cost, right? So Anthony Fauci, get rid of the virus at any cost, including the economy, children, whatever. There's people now, social justice at any cost, equality or equity at any cost. And so like, these are the people you have to be most wary of. And again, to the point I made earlier, it's not necessarily malicious. It's just narrow-minded. I think, as I mentioned before, I think pride and arrogance plays a huge role in it. One of the things Hayek says here is it's often they have an exaggerated understanding of the importance of their goals. Climate alarmists, for example, I think have an exaggerated understanding of the importance of their goals. Someone might hear me say, climate change doesn't matter. No. You don't redirect the entire world economy to some, globalist, great reset, you'll own nothing and be happy kind of thing in the name of climate change. It's an exaggerated importance of those goals. I
mean, there's still, just to stick on that for a bit. I mean, the climate alarmists are still the people who think overpopulation is a huge problem, which we know.
I'm cool with them not having kids, by the way.
Yeah.
And also opting out of the gene pool entirely if they
voluntarily.
Yep.
But yes, this is perfectly summed up. And I would love to get Hayek's response, because you probably have to write another chapter on this. Just the phrase, listen to the experts, how that has run our lives. And even though it's a phrase, just like believe in science, although believe in science is loaded because science is not an ideology. It's not meant to be believed. It's meant to be tested. But it is one of those things that rely heavily on the experts and what the experts say about this very narrow field that they're extremely good in. You know, when someone tells me listen to the experts, you got to say which ones. And,
Yep.
you know, this situation right now is a little too complicated for I have one single-minded specialist telling me what to do with my entire life. Right.
Yep.
So, you know, this listen to the experts thing, or even our society feeling right now coming out of the pandemic seems like it's been run by experts, the experts for the past year and a half. We've kind of beta tested it, didn't we?
How'd that go?
And exactly. So if you know, I mean, to me, the pandemic is just like Hayek talked about what happens in wartime. You need some planning in wartime, but it is not a constant state that you want to be in when you're in peacetime. You know, it is meant for the specific short period in time, and you do not want to create your future economy based on this short window in which you needed to plan to achieve your goals. We don't want to plan our future economy based on pandemic-like responses. And some of the liberties that we did have to give up, which I think in some cases that, yeah, it made sense to wear a mask sometimes. It made sense to socially distance. It made sense to do a lot of this stuff, but this is not the constant state we want to be in.
Yep.
And I think if Hayek were around to say that, he would highlight this in a full chapter to say, you know, we have to be able, just like in wartime, we have to be able to bring back competition and to go back on the road, even if you had to sit on a park bench for a little bit because something bad happened. It's time to get back on the road and keep moving forward.
Yep. Benjamin Boyce had a great tweet about this last night, where he said it was like a screenshot of like experts say something. I think it was about masks. I don't know. And he said experts is today's local man. Like, or, you know, it's like local man says, or that, you know, does whatever. And, you know, I made the points like everything's inverted. You know, it's not going to be long before if you meet some kid who's normal and knows things, you'll assume they're homeschooled. And if you meet some kid who's socially awkward and has all these issues and is eating bugs, you'll assume that they're public schooled and have 2 PhDs from Ivy League institutions.
Yeah. The experts are the local man, but Dr. Fauci is a Florida man.
Florida man. That's exactly right. I was like, yep. Florida man says 2 masks. And so, and then also no mask at all. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And it speaks to the institution problem, because what creates experts, right? The institutions, the credentialing system, which we've talked about before, I think at least maybe 200 times. So, so anyway, yeah. So I think that's a good place. Do you want to sum up that last chapter, and then that seems like a good place to end it?
Yeah. I mean, chapter 4, it really puts it out there in I love the way he titles these chapters, but the inevitability of planning. It is any excuse people who are advocates of planning can make to move in that direction.
Climate, race, social justice.
They use, scare tactics like the impending monopoly. That's the capital or the corporation that's going to control your life. They use, the experts that, who should be the ones who should know how to run your life, because they try to broaden these experts out to life gurus instead of just people who are really good at this one small little thing. And so it's really giving all those excuses to the people who are still fighting against it, still saying like, I don't think I should give up my liberty for all of these things. I think maybe, just maybe, the road that got us here is a road we should stick on, rather than completely scrapping it. Because as we covered in the previous chapters, they're not trying to make improvements on the road that we're on. They are trying to leave this road for another one. They're trying to abandon this road for the great utopia.
Yep. And I think just my final point on that is just going back to the general prescience and relevance of this work, is when Hayek mentions at the beginning, all these people advocating for this stuff, this is a Marxian idea. This is Marxian ideology at its core. And all of these intellectuals, all of these people advocating for it have received it third and fourth hand, and they don't know what they're arguing for, which is why if they saw the result of their ideas put into practice to the full, most good people would be horrified by it and would be like, no, this is not what I signed up for. This is square peg, round hole. Like, no, I thought I was signing for something else. And that today is the exact thing. Critical race theory is a Marxian ideology rooted in conflict theory, going back to Hegel. I think James Lindsay argues rightly. And there's all these people who you tell them, So let's do a one for one, map it. So Hayek saying, you're advocating for socialism. This is going to lead to tyranny, the end of freedom, and this is a road to servitude. Socialism is slavery. I think is what he quoted Tocqueville at, right? And the socialists of that day would say, you're insane. How could you say that? That is not how this works. Here's all my intentions and why they're good and why you're crazy. Take it today. Critical race theory is a Marxian ideology. This is arguing for and will lead to straight up discrimination and going back to racism and, racist subculture. And this is supremacist ideas and will destroy us. And what do the people say today? No, that's not at all. That's not at all true. Oh, I have good intentions. No, of course, it'll create all of these good things. How could you say that? And just like the socialists then didn't realize they were arguing for Marxian ideology that would lead to Marxian outcomes, that people today arguing for this stuff, whether it's the Green New Deal or whatever thing, don't realize it. And they have the exact same incredulous response whenever you tell them that. And they don't know what they're arguing for. They don't know.
100%. Well, we're leaning up against almost 2 hours, getting 45. But for those of you listening, watching, this is episode 3. So we have 2 episodes before this. If you haven't listened or watched those, check them out. It's good to just have these in order, or you can really any order you want to. But as Truman said, there are free resources to find the book. Audible.com. If you have an Audible account, you get the book for free there as well. So that's how we both listen to it. But for any other stuff, make sure to check out Truman at returntoreason.locals.com for his locals community. You can also look at Return to Reason on ThinkSpot. You can do it YouTube. You also publish some writing on Medium, and then at My Mundane Mind on Twitter. And then you can find me, Engineering Politics, engineeringpolitics.locals.com, Engineering Politics ThinkSpot, YouTube, ENG_politics on Twitter. I publish stuff all over the place. So you can really find my stuff anywhere. But is that it?
I think that's it, man. We can call it there. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Peace.